Why would somebody risk and in fact give up their life to prove that you have to keep Shabbos? And not only did he want to teach us about Shabbos, he wanted to teach us something fundamental about the whole of Jewish observance, as we shall see from the story of the Mekoshesh, the infamous person who chopped wood on Shabbos in the desert. That's at the end of this week's parasha. So parasha seinu. Hevi Rashi b'firusha b'shem Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan. Rashi quotes Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan. It says, "Lama nismecha parshas Mekoshesh leparshas avodas halilim." How come the Torah puts the story of the person who chopped wood on Shabbos right next to the story of avodah zarah? To teach us loymar shamechalel es Shabbos, that if a person desecrates Shabbos chas v'shalom ka'ovid avodas halilim, that is equated to serving idols. Because Shabbos is also equated to all the mitzvahs, like belief in Hashem, and therefore the flip side of it, idolatry, is comparable to all the mitzvahs. Like we famously say, the person who rejects idolatry upholds the whole Torah, and chas v'shalom, vice versa. Now Tosfos says on the same thing, also why are these side by side? The chronological place of the story of the Mekoshesh who chopped the wood is at the beginning of the 40 years in the desert, right around the same time as the story of the Meraglim, as it appears in our parasha. And the Medrash tells us, why did he chop the wood? He had a higher intention. Because after the debacle of the spies, the Eden said, because as a result of the debacle of the spies, they were told they're not going into Eretz Yisrael. They thought, okay, that's it. We're not obligated to fulfill mitzvahs. Therefore, Omad v'chilul Shabbos. Therefore, the Mekoshesh got up and publicly desecrated Shabbos. So he should be killed. And everybody else should see. Mitzvahs are relevant even now. And in that context, it makes perfect sense why the story of the Mekoshesh belongs in our parasha, because our parasha is all about the debacle of the Meraglim. That is the main theme of our parasha. Our parasha, Shelach. In fact, that's how the parasha gets its name, Shelach. Why? Because Tosfos, quoting the Medrash, tells us the story of the Mekoshesh is a direct outcome of the story of the Meraglim. Omnom, but what the Medrash hasn't addressed is why it's so close to the story of idolatry. Look at the chronology in the parasha. First you have the story of the Meraglim, then you have the prohibition against idolatry, and then you have the story of the Mekoshesh. Move on. That means that the Tosfos must also see a link between the story of the Mekoshesh and the prohibition against idolatry. Something similar, surely, to what Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan said, as quoted in Rashi. As the Tosfos in the Gemara comment, Moshe Rabbeinu knew that the Mekoshesh deserved to be killed because he had broken Shabbos, and because the pasuk tells us that the person who desecrates Shabbos surely shall die. But he didn't know which of the four forms of execution is appropriate for this person. Even though typically when the Torah just uses the generic term that a person should be killed, it means strangulation. So now Tosfos is pointing out, Moshe Rabbeinu logically linked it to the punishment for idolatry, which is stoning. Why? Because a person who publicly desecrates Shabbos, as the Mekoshesh did, it's as if that person is completely denying Hashem. The kofer b'maisa bereishis, because avodah zarah is where a person denies that Hashem exists, and a person who breaks Shabbos denies the fact that Hashem created the world in a very specific way on 6 days, resting on the seventh. Therefore, they are similar. Therefore, the punish should be similar. Let's take it a step deeper. What that shows us is that there's a link between the nature of the sin of breaking Shabbos and the nature of the sin of idolatry. And therefore, the nature of the punishment should be similar. But the Torah illustrated not just that generically Shabbos, breaking Shabbos, is similar to idolatry, but specifically this man who publicly chopped wood on Shabbos, that is similar to breaking Shabbos, to idolatry. There's got to be some deeper link between the nature of idolatry and the nature of how this individual who had good intentions, l'shem shamayim, broke Shabbos. And seeing as this is all part of Parashat Shelach, which is primarily the story of the Meraglim, there's got to be something about the nature of idolatry, the nature of what kind of desecration of Shabbos the Mekoshesh did, which should link back to the nature of what the Meraglim got wrong. What is that? Let's analyze the Medrash that Tosfos quoted. And based on that, we'll understand this better. What did the Medrash say? That the Mekoshesh had intentions for the sake of heaven, because the people claimed that as a result of the Meraglim they are no longer obligated to fulfill mitzvahs. Therefore, he wanted to make a public statement. No, mitzvahs are very much enforced. Look at this. I'm going to do something and be killed for it in order that you all know that mitzvahs are applicable. Now, if you want to show the people that the mitzvahs are still applicable despite their belief to the contrary, you don't have to do something so radical. If the Mekoshesh had the intention to show the Jewish people you are still required to fulfill mitzvahs, why does he have to break Shabbos? Especially because he, choosing to break Shabbos, desecrates another even more serious sin, which is suicide. Because it's suicide by Beis Din. He's causing himself to be killed. Surely he could have done a less radical expression or example of the fact that mitzvahs are still relevant by desecrating a lesser avera. It could have actually been a very light avera, something that would have earned him the punishment of lashes or a financial penalty. Still would have illustrated the point that your mitzvahs are still relevant. Why does he go so radical and break Shabbos, which is a capital offense? Now, Targum Yonasan also pretty much gives the same message. That the person who chopped the wood wasn't looking to desecrate Shabbos, but rather to sanctify Hashem's name. He explains as follows. The Targum Yonasan says, why Shabbos rather than something else? Because at that time they only knew that there is a law that you may not desecrate Shabbos. But what happens when you do break Shabbos? That information they didn't yet have. So therefore, says the Targum Yonasan, so he thought if he breaks Shabbos, then everybody will know not only that you should not break Shabbos, not only that there is a punishment for breaking Shabbos, but what that punishment is. That's the Targum Yonasan. But the Medrash didn't say that. The Medrash said that his intention was to illustrate to the Jewish people they are still required to fulfill mitzvahs, not that there is a specific punishment for Chilul Shabbos. Now, from the Medrash perspective, why did he have to choose to break Shabbos? He could have just shown them anything that Torah mitzvahs are relevant. So to explain that, let's ask another interesting halachic question about his intentions. So the Maharsha, one of the primary commentators on the Gemara, addresses this question. How could this person chop wood on Shabbos, which is breaking Shabbos, to illustrate the fact that you can't break Shabbos and it's a capital offense? Why is it the halachic problem? Because he didn't need the wood that he was chopping, and the only reason he was doing it was to make a big example of himself to the whole community so they would know to respect Shabbos. In that case, halachically, that is an example where a person does one of the forbidden actions of Shabbos where they have no need in the action itself. So there's a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon in the Gemara in Shabbos. If a person breaks a law of Shabbos without intention of having direct value out of the action themselves. For example, the person who digs a hole. So you may not dig a hole on Shabbos, but this person is not interested in the hole. He just needs sand for some other means, some other purpose. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that is still a problem, and he has still desecrated Shabbos, and he's still liable, and if he did it intentionally, was warned by witnesses, it's a capital offense. According to Rabbi Shimon, he didn't need the hole. So therefore, the activity which is forbidden, was not serving him any purpose, his potter means you're not allowed to do it, but you can't be punished for it. So using Rabbi Shimon's logic, the Mekoishesh doesn't need the wood, he's just trying to make a point, so then he's not really breaking Shabbos. If he's not really breaking Shabbos, why is he being punished for breaking Shabbos? And the Maharsha says that the Medrash suggesting that the reason he chopped the wood was to show everybody that you're breaking Shabbos and that is a capital offense. Turns out it's not really the classic breaking Shabbos, at least not according to Rabbi Shimon. And that would explain why the Medrash says that would explain why the Mekoshesh, who wanted to teach people that mitzvahs are still relevant, specifically chose to break Shabbos. Because he didn't really want to have an Aveira. Remember, his intention is l'shem shamayim. So he doesn't actually want to have an Aveira on his hands. So he knows his intention, which nobody else knows. So he knows that he's not really liable for breaking Shabbos. But nobody else is going to know, and therefore they'll execute him, which is going to achieve his purpose to show the whole community that you shouldn't break Shabbos. But that's something that can only apply to Shabbos. There are no other examples really where you can do this. Because in Shabbos you've got this class of behavior which is wrong, but not punishable, at least according to Rabbi Shimon. As the Kedushas Levi says, he actually technically did not break Shabbos, which speaks a lot more to his intention, l'shem shamayim. Why would you do something that is spiritually wrong, that is harmful to your neshama, if you want to do l'shem shamayim? Clearly, if it's not really an aveira, then you could say, well, it's l'shem shamayim. Now, his intentions aside, the reality is he's killed for it. This man has to be put to death by stoning. Which means that the Eibishter is saying he is liable for death penalty. Not the humans who don't know any better and can't read his mind. The Eibishter is saying he's liable. Why? Even though the Eibishter knows what's inside a person's heart and knows that he had no benefit or purpose in the wood, and therefore it's melacha she'ina tzricha legufa, for which a person is not chayiv, and therefore he shouldn't have to die. And the Eibishter knows that his intentions were noble. And in fact, he didn't technically break Shabbos, to the contrary. He was actually strengthening Shabbos observance between everybody else. In other words, in other words, his intention was, I'm going to do this, and everybody else is going to be better in their Shabbos observance. And they'll also realize that all of Torah mitzvahs are still in force, and therefore they'll be committed to all of Torah mitzvahs, and that's going to affect the entire Jewish people. He's got a great, the Eibishter knows this. And as the Maharsha points out, the witnesses who saw him do this didn't know his intentions, and therefore when they warned him, don't do this because it's breaking Shabbos, they didn't know about the mitigating circumstances that he's really trying to prove a point. That was internal. When a court has to judge a person, we judge based on testimony, not based on feelings. And that, by the way, is the difference between a human court and the Eibishter's court. That's why when a person is sentenced in a human court to execution, even if they do tshuva afterwards, there's nothing we can do to undo the sentence. Whereas, if the Eibishter decides that a person, chas v'sholem, has to have misa b'dei shamayim, and then they do tshuva, the Eibishter can read into the heart, know that they've done tshuva, and remove the threat. So it's not that they didn't know what they were doing and they mistakenly killed him. No, following halachic process, it was the correct thing to execute him. Shara Torah hi Torah semes, because we're dealing with a Torah of absolute truth. And if the truth of the halachic process would be that this person, the Mekoshesh, is not liable for death, the Eibishter would never have instructed him to be executed. And this is going to be critical to our understanding of the whole story, that when it comes to the human courts, we judge actions over intentions. If a person did an illegal action, then their noble intentions don't count. Because the action in this case was an action of desecrating Shabbos, So the Beis Din says this action deserves execution through the form of skila. Intentions do not soften that law. Now that we know that we're looking at actions rather than intentions, there's a strong connection between the story of the Mekoshesh and the story of Avodah Zarah, because we know how Jews react to Avodah Zarah. When it comes to idolatry, you find something unique which doesn't apply really to any other mitzvah, which is every single Jew, even the least spiritual, when they are challenged to have to accept idolatry, the person would rather die. As the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, not even to do some superficial action that could be interpreted as idolatrous or rejection of Hashem. Like, for example, okay, I'm just going to bow. It's just purely perfunctory. It's just a movement. Without any belief inside the person's heart. Now that's strange, right? Because isn't Avodah Zarah all about belief, and isn't belief all about intention? So how is it that an action without intention is a problem with Avodah Zarah? But we have to understand. The real issue with Avodah Zarah is the faith that a person has internally, giving any credibility to the independent power of something other than the Eibishter. That is idolatry. Any created being, malach, galgal, or koichov, whether it is an angel, whether it's some astrological system, whether it's an individual star, and there has to be the intention of accepting this as some kind of a deity. But if, as the Alter Rebbe says, there's no vestige of faith in this deity, that's not idolatry. The person has not created distance between themselves and God. And if the person did not stand up and give up their life for Hashem, okay, would say that they were forced into a situation, they're actually not liable, they haven't already transgressed. So, legally, no big deal just to pay lip service to a deity. And yet, the fact that this would be construed as an action, a behavior of idolatry, even though it does not have the intention, the meaning of idolatry, the average Jewish person says, not on, it's not kosher, it's idolatry. And he's willing to die rather than to do it. That then is the link between the story of the person chopping wood, where his intention is not what determines that he's liable, and the fact that a person is not willing to serve Avodah Zarah, even if it's just actions without intentions, and he's willing to die for that. The nature of work on Shabbos has everything to do with a person's intention. There's the link. The Gemara tells us that the kind of activity that is forbidden on Shabbos is intentional activity. That's why a person is not liable for punishment if they did something which transgresses Shabbos for a purpose that has nothing to do with what they did. Like the person digging the hole, but he doesn't really care about the hole. He just needed sand for whatever purpose. Now, especially in our case of the Mekoshesh, not only is his intention not to break Shabbos, not to benefit from the breaking of Shabbos, but to the contrary, his intention is to sanctify Hashem's name, which means he's not really desecrating Shabbos, he's actually glorifying Hashem. But the action, as seen by the audience, is an action of transgressing Shabbos. When a guy's chopping wood, you can't see from the fact that he's chopping wood that he doesn't need the wood. To the contrary, it looks exactly like he needs the wood. That person has to be punished, and in the highest level of punishment, because what he's done is illegal. So it's like the person who won't serve Avodah Zarah, even though the intention is not there, but what is done is Avodah Zarah, as if he wants to have nothing to do with it. So that tells you the primacy of action over intention, which is very much the story of the Meraglim and the post-Meraglim period. This ties now the story of the person chopping wood on Shabbos to the story of the Meraglim. We know very well that in multiple places in Chassidus it explains why did the Meraglim prefer to stay in the desert and not want to go into Eretz Yisrael? Because as long as the Jewish people were in the desert and didn't have to have the stress of earning a living, what was their primary occupation? Was learning Torah. As we know, that the Gemara tells us, those Yidden who were fed by the mon, they were the only people who really had the opportunity to mine the wealth of Torah properly. And what is Limud Torah? It's primarily an intellectual pursuit. And the fact that you're supposed to say the words when you learn Torah. But that's pretty much about as low as it goes into the world of speech. But when they go into Eretz Yisrael, they're going to have to be farmers who work 6 out of 7 years. And primarily, the focus of how you serve the Eibishter in Eretz Yisrael is through actions. Mitzvahs maisias, practical mitzvahs. Especially those mitzvahs that can only be performed in Eretz Yisrael. As well as generally doing good deeds or mitzvahs that are good and special and focused. That explains what the Medrash is saying, the Medrash that Tosfos quoted. As soon as the Yidden learnt that they were going to be barred from entering Eretz Yisrael because of the story of the Meraglim, they thought, okay, in that case we don't need mitzvahs maisias, we go back to this intellectual Torah experience. The simple understanding of the Medrash implies it's not that they wanted to rebel against Hashem and say, we're no longer doing mitzvahs. That's it. You're not letting us into the land. We're fighting back and we're going to reject Judaism. No. They thought that they were given a signal by Hashem, you are not obliged to fulfill mitzvahs. You have to wonder, where did they get that idea from? What made them believe that they're off the hook for mitzvahs? Had they said, we have been destined to die, therefore we don't have to do mitzvahs, that would make sense. But or something along those lines. So then you could have kind of squeezed out an explanation on their behalf, which is, once they have been condemned to death, they are like walking dead. There's an halachic principle that once the courts have ruled that a person is to be executed, they have a status of being the walking dead, which means they're no longer obligated to fulfill mitzvahs. But that's not what they said. How come, what's the logic of the Medrash telling us that they believed that because they were now barred from going into Eretz Yisrael, therefore they're no longer required to fulfill mitzvahs? Well, now we know. It makes sense based on what we've explained. This was exactly their logic. Why is there a reason to go into Eretz Yisrael? It's to have the opportunity to fulfill physical mitzvahs. Therefore, they figured if they have now been decreed that they may not enter Eretz Yisrael because of the story of the Meraglim, then they're not required to do mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are primarily for Israel. They believed this is a symbol to us, a signal to us, that the mitzvahs, which are primarily physical activities, are not our business. Including even mitzvahs that they had already done up until this point. Especially because certain of those mitzvahs were given to them to open the opportunity for them to go to Israel. You can't say Israel, that they're told, if you fulfill these mitzvahs, you're going to Israel. Well, now we're not going into Israel anymore. Why do these mitzvahs? In their minds, if we're not going into Eretz Yisrael, we can retreat back into a world of machshava, into a world of study, into a world of academia, and that's where we'll be. We'll learn Torah, and that's going to be our focus. Therefore, the Mekoshas recognized that they were misunderstanding what's going on, and therefore, he got up and transgressed Shabbos, so he should be killed. And everybody should realize, mitzvahs maisias are relevant to us even in the desert. Look what he's showing them. Here's a mitzvah where everything that defines the nature of this mitzvah, or in this case, the nature of the transgression, is your intention, in other words, your mind, the thing that you believe is your focus right now. And look, I'm applying my mind in an appropriate way, not to transgress. Yet, I'm going to illustrate to you that with all the best intention and learning and knowledge in the world, actions count. And that's why the Torah, which is absolute truth, will define this activity in spite of its motivation as desecrating Shabbos, punishable by death. Their story was going to illustrate to those Jews remaining at that point in the desert that despite the fact that they were barred from entering the land, what that means is you will never reach that ultimate state of fulfilling mitzvahs as is available in Eretz Yisrael. But even as you are in the desert, still the bottom line is what's most important, what you do. At least to the extent of what is feasible in the desert. And the reason for that is because the purpose of a mitzvah is to create a bond between you and Hashem. And the only way to create a real bond between you and Hashem is by doing mitzvahs practically. Not even in the time of the Midbar, just by living in a spiritual realm of learning and connecting to Hashem in an abstract fashion.